Man, Sonic's a bit of a controversial figure nowadays, isn't he? It just seems like no matter what he's in or what direction they try to take, there's just no way it's going to pan out. Now, admittedly, a part of that problem lies with a fan base that can't seem to agree with itself long enough to actually figure out what makes a good Sonic game, while simultaneously making any Sonic game successful even when they brand it to be less than mediocre, and the other part of this is from a studio that doesn't seem confident enough in itself to commit to any one single idea or gameplay style to give the series something resembling cohesion. But this isn't about modern Sonic or even about the games at all. You might not know it now, but back in the early 90s, Sonic was an inescapable icon, presenting himself as the cooler, more edgy alternative to Mario, with games that were all about more contemporary music, heavier colors, faster speeds. It took the usual precision and timing formula from games past and transformed it into something more about seeing just how fast you could go, until the game decided you had to be careful and precise again. I feel like it would be an exaggeration to say it was as big as the original wave of Pokemania that hit the States, but to a kid just learning how to play video games and totally enamored with the character, it sure did feel that big. And along with the games, you of course had a massive influx of merchandise and cross-media deals, which would of course lead to cartoons. Because if Mario had a cartoon, then Sonic had to have one as well. Or rather, he had two, plus a few others later on, but the earliest cartoons for Sonic were the Saturday morning cartoon show and the weekday show, a massive 65-episode cash-in known as Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog. A show which provided the early internet with plenty of beloved memes and material for the much-loved YouTube poops. After all, who could forget the absolute classic that was Super Robotnik Land? Oh, no clip? Okay then, let's move on. I'll just get this out of the way now. Objectively, even for the time, the series was not that good. The fact that it had Sonic in it was more of an afterthought, as both its stories and its visuals were a weird combination of overly simplistic and incredibly odd. And yet, and I know this is probably going to destroy any sort of credibility I have, I find myself really liking this series. I'm not blind, I know it has flaws, plenty of flaws, but I enjoy it unironically. I can't even use the defense of watching it as a guilty pleasure because that would imply that I feel guilty that I find something this objectively mediocre to be fun. And that's just not the case. It's not even nostalgia. I can think of plenty of stuff I watched from my childhood that I loved then but can't go back to now, and yet Adventures is definitely not part of that group. I can't call the series a masterpiece, that's for sure. Dic, while they did put out some quality shows during their tenure, was also known for putting out cheap cash-ins based around popular franchises, of which this happens to be one. The basic plot of the series overall isn't that much different from the games that were out at the time. Sonic and Tails are globe-trotting adventurers, doing their best to right the wrongs of the world and help anyone that they can, which more often than not brings them into conflict with the self-styled dictator of Mobius and self-stated genius, Dr. Ivo Robotnik, who is constantly trying to destroy Sonic and Tails and conquer the world for himself. He's assisted in this endeavor by the Super Sonic Search and Smash Squad, or the SSSSS for short, consisting of Robotic Chicken Scratch, Robotic Robot Grounder, and occasionally Robotic Ape and literal Butt Monkey Coconuts. Pretty much every single episode of the show would revolve around Robotnik enacting a plan to try to take over the world or destroy Sonic. Sonic finds out about it and then sets out to stop it. There were minor variations and a lot of one-shot and recurring characters, but the basic formula was about as predictable as could be, with the main draw being just how it would play out every day. I can only imagine that most script pitch meetings for this show were started with the phrase, "what if?" Because most of these adventures can be summed up with a question along those lines, like, what if Robotnik outlawed all music? Or what if Robotnik gained superpowers? Or what if Sonic's shoes were stolen? And from each of those questions was birthed a full 22-minute episode of pure insanity, starring a two-tailed fox, a blue hedgehog, and an egg-shaped mad scientist. Right off the bat, I will give this series points for its portrayal of the main characters. This was during a time before Sonic really had much of a definable personality beyond what we saw in the game, which, to be fair, he did have more obvious personality traits and attitudes compared to his plucky Italian rival. I'll admit that sort of attitude is definitely a time capsule of the period. The early and mid-90s had tons of examples of this, and while it's dated, it's probably as true to Sonic's character as someone could get, before he transitioned into being much more of an overt jokester when the games became the primary focus of the franchise.
Oh hey, sounds like the party started. Wanna let me go and join in? No? Of course not. You hate fun.
Tails, while being stated to be incredibly young in this version, and much more naive, does show some early gadgeteer genius tendencies, and in the few cases where he had to act on his own, he does show a certain level of intuitiveness, but more often than not, he's basically just either the kidnapped kid or Sonic's assistant. Which seems to suit him just fine. He's mostly just happy to be at Sonic's side and help him whenever possible. This was when he was directly looking up to Sonic, keep in mind, as opposed to, well, again, the sarcastic jokester he would become later on.
True, it would be pretty hard to miss a giant floating space amusement park surrounded by planets.
So while our main heroes are pretty typical and seem to fit fine into their respective roles, and were perfectly fine characters in their own right for this type of show, if a little on the dated side, the real attraction for the show, for me, was the villains. Nowadays, Dr. Eggman is a great blend of comedic and threatening, a combo that is actually not that easy to pull off. However, during this point in time, he was either one or the other, and his portrayal would change depending on the tone of the show, and sometimes the situation. Here, though, he is well and truly on the side of comedy, portrayed more as an ineffectual villain most of the time, which only makes the times when he does come close to victory all the more surprising. And the show gives a lot of focus to Robotnik. I'd say he and his minions, on average, get at least 50% of the show's screen time. And more often than not, it's glorious. Robotnik is beautifully manic here, and exaggerated to all hell, with his body movements and proportions constantly altering and changing to whatever the animator at the time thought would be funny. And of course, he is played by the late, great Long John Baldry, who just has the most impeccable, amazing voice for this sort of character.
And then there was the time I restructured the DNA of our class's pet hamster. Turned it into a tapeworm. That was especially evil.
Seriously, every voice actor in this series sounds like they're having some fun with what they're doing, but Baldry in particular just chews up every single scene that Robotnik is in, and combine that with the deranged animation, it is a winning recipe. His two cronies, most often seen in the series, Scratch and Grounder, also have pretty recognizable voices that fit their characters pretty well, though whether you find their Wile E. Coyote-esque antics against Sonic and Tails to be charming or annoying is more up to personal preference.
See ya! I can't move!
What are you griping about? You wanted that wrench set, didn't you?
Me, I think it works well. It doesn't attempt to hide the fact that it is very heavily inspired by, some might even say ripping off, the original Chase cartoons during the golden age of animation, and while these scenarios don't hold a candle in terms of execution to the original shorts they were based on, I still find them enjoyable, mostly because they're interspersed in between plenty of other things that happen throughout each episode. Every now and then, Scratch and Grounder would be joined by the red-headed stepchild of Robotnik's creations, Coconuts, who mostly worked on his own, and while he was a little more clever than the other robots, he was still pretty dumb and mostly only did what he did because he craved Robotnik's attention. It's actually rather sad, all things considered. There was also a healthy catalog of secondary recurring characters such as Professor Von Schlemmer, Mama Robotnik, Wes Weasley, and Professor K-9 that managed to make the series feel like a slightly more cohesive world rather than just a string of unrelated random adventures. Which it is, but the recurring characters at least give some form of consistency, because the environments definitely don't. While there is some basic lip service paid to some of the areas from the games, one episode in particular takes place specifically in an area called Casino Night Zone, but almost every place is made from the writers' minds and wholly original. It's just a shame that most of them don't look that good. Yes, as much as I love the animation of this series, the backgrounds and environments, more often than not, do not look terribly good. They definitely look alien, but quite often they come off as particularly barren, and as nice as the color palettes of the series can be, I often find that the characters clash heavily with the static backgrounds, which more often than not have much softer colors and no real outlines or definable boundaries, which just makes them look weird when the far more detailed characters are walking around in them. There were a few good highlights though. The entire Chaos Emerald saga, a series of 5 episodes that was really the only instance of some sort of story arc in the series, got a massive bump in animation quality, being done by TMS Entertainment, an animation studio that would also have another Sonic-related project on their plate several years later that wouldn't turn out nearly as good. Make of that statement what you will.
Gotta go fast! Gotta go fast!
But again, the actual animation of the show is good, in a deranged sort of way. Dic was rather infamous for some of the big animation mistakes they'd leave in some of their series. I'll admit Adventures is not exempt from this, as I believe this might be the series that started the whole Sonic's arms aren't blue thing, as cell and coloring errors would often result in his arms being miscolored, but more often than not, the bizarre way that the show was animated was a stylistic choice, more often than not. The animators were told, especially when it came to Robotnik and his minions, to go out of their way to exaggerate their body movements as much as possible, which did a lot to hide the fact that the production was obviously on a much stricter budget than, say, the Saturday morning cartoon, which had much more detailed backgrounds and overall better, more consistent animation. It can still look cheap at times, and when the budget bottoms out, it is really obvious. But most of the time, the show was pretty good about hiding its lack of budget with some very impressive exaggeration and squash and stretch, which of course is one of the biggest cornerstones of animation. I mentioned Baldry before when talking about the voice actors for the series because he really was the standout performer for the entire show, but the other voice actors are not slouches in any way. Scratch and Grounder, like I said, can be polarizing, but I think the two voices work well together, and fit the characters in a way that makes them less annoying and more entertaining. Fun fact, the voice actors for Scratch and Grounder, Phil Hayes and Gary Chalk respectively, were originally cast as their opposites, but the dialogue just wasn't working. Threatened with either figuring something out that worked or being fired, the two of them decided to switch roles, and suddenly everything was working out a heck of a lot more. Sonic, as most people are aware by now, is played by Jaleel White, most well known for his role as Urkel in Family Matters, but he actually shows off some pretty decent range in this role. It was probably just fun to break from what he was known for at the time, and he really does bring Sonic's 90s too to the forefront here. I like it. And Chris Welch as Tails, it's rare to find decent kid actors, and I'd say he did a damn fine job considering how young he was at the time. And in general, the voice acting, for as maligned as the show can be, is really good all throughout. Outside of the main recurring cast, Michael Donovan as Wes Weasley and Kathy Westluck, as well a ton of secondary and incidental voices, are particular standouts.
Gee, Dr. Robotnik was really mad.
Well, it's his loss, palsy. He has no idea of the value of my magical supplies.
But man, does that soundtrack stick with you. It's not particularly varied, that's for sure, mostly only using the same few tracks over and over again with minor ambience timed for the actions on screen otherwise, but the tracks are at least very memorable and very catchy. First is the main theme of the series, a rather fun and interesting mix of a remix of the first game's main theme and the Hall of the Mountain King. You hear it once, and it manages to stay with you for a good long while, that's for sure. And then there is the greatest villain theme of all time. Robotnik's theme is just amazing. And every time I hear the first few notes of it, I know that hijinks are about to ensue, and despite being the villain's main theme, it is far from threatening, which I perfectly think fits Robotnik's comedic tone, and the fact that he is basically a secondary main character in this show. But then you have the most infamous part of the show, the Sonic Sez segments that would play at the end of every episode. Despite the cartoonish and comedic nature of the show itself, these were out-of-place Aesops, basically designed to be as simplistic as possible, teaching kids important life lessons like don't smoke cigarettes or drink booze, Don't climb into dryers, don't cheat, don't accept gifts or favors from strangers, and don't let people touch you if it makes you feel uncomfortable. That last one was especially jarring given the usual fare of the show. These mostly came about due to the broadcast standards and practices of the time, when anything that was broadcast during certain hours had to have a certain amount of educational or morally sound content. Apparently, the 30-second PSAs at the end of each episode were enough to match that. That's also why you had them on shows like G.I. Joe, of all things, though the only time I ever thought they were any sort of appropriate was during Captain Planet, as the show itself was already a massive PSA to begin with. Still can't deny that the Sez segments gave us plenty of riffable moments. Heck, the show was like that all over, but while the plots would be rather typical cartoon fare, they did occasionally have some really inspired gags that managed to stand out, that just had perfect blending of timing, execution, and ridiculousness.
Oh! Hey, how'd he do that?
Does it hold up to cartoons today? Well, no, not really. As enjoyable as it is, it does come off as a rather obvious time capsule of the decade it was released in, at least in terms of weekday animation. I do still think it's worth a second look in spite of its flaws. If you grew up with it, I can see you still having some fun with it, but if you didn't grow up with it, it's still worth watching, if only for this iteration of Robotnik. He is a top-tier comedic villain. And the show itself, I think, is an excellent example of something becoming funny in a totally unintentional manner. It's tough to tell at times if I'm smiling at the joke they told or the way the joke is presented, but either way, I reiterate the point that I do genuinely enjoy this show, warts and all, and it never fails to make me grin. If you're interested in the series at all, it's still readily available. All episodes are available for streaming on Amazon, though you do need the Con TV package to actually watch it, and the series has been out on DVD for basically ever at this point, though all on different sets, and while the first volume is still available for purchase brand new, the second and third sets are a little bit tougher to come by, but still easy enough to find and for relatively cheap too. There were plenty of other Sonic cartoons too over the years, but we'll get to those sometime down the line. Wouldn't be the first time I've talked about them either. For now, I was just feeling a little nostalgic, and I think we can all agree we have at least one show, book, game, or piece of media that, no matter how flawed or terrible it may be, we just can't help but love. And I think that's pretty awesome. I'll see you all next time, everyone.
Ah! I hate that hedgehog!